1989 was a good year. 1989 was the year that my best friend and I were baptized on April Fool's Day. I still remember thinking, were they going to tell us we're just kidding at some point during the day? They didn't, thankfully. 1989 was the year I graduated from high school also. So graduated from high school, got baptized. 1989 was also a year of infamy. Not because I was baptized and graduated from high school. But for a lot of people here, I think they wouldn't remember 1989. That was 33 years ago. And I guess that sets the stage from, kind of starts to landmark me as how old I am. But for a lot of you, you don't remember 1989 because you weren't around. In 1989, not only were my best friend and I baptized, but there was a revolution of sorts that happened in China. Protests happened in over 400 cities. In Beijing, over 1 million people protested at one point. They got out onto the streets of Beijing and protested the inequity in their society. They were pro-democracy, and those protests kind of culminated in Tiananmen Square in a series of protests over a long period of time called the Tiananmen Square protests. That phrase, Tiananmen Square, might start to ring a bell with some of you. During that time, from what I understand, there was a lot of debate and power, kind of pulling for power, even within the Communist Party at the highest level of leadership. There was a group that wanted to work with the students and with the people, and in the end, they lost. And the group that was more authoritarian and wanted to keep things the way they were won. And what that meant was that on one day in June, specifically on June 4th of 1989, just a couple months after I was baptized, soldiers and tanks who had been already there watching the protests did more than watch that day. They opened fire. And reportedly, thousands of people were killed, and thousands more wounded, and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, were arrested. Why do I bring up Tiananmen Square? Why do we care about Tiananmen Square from 1989, from 33 years ago? Well, in 2021, on Christmas Eve, if you pay attention to what's happening around the world, 2 statues in Hong Kong were taken down in the middle of the night. There were 2 statues that commemorated the Tiananmen Square massacre, and they were taken down because there was concerns about their safety and that they might fall on people. I'm not going to blame China for doing it. I mean, they're the ones that did it, right? But this idea of removing statues is interesting. If you look up Tiananmen Square online and the Tiananmen Square protests and the Tiananmen Square massacre, what you start to find, even within information online, is you start to see words like alleged added to the definitions and to the descriptions of what happened. And so I would propose that certain people are actively pursuing changing the conversation and changing the memory of what happened to be more in line with what they want to have happened. And that's not just China that does it. In the United States, over the last 6 years, we've removed 170 different statues around the country because we as a people in the United States feel that those statues don't appropriately portray what we should remember about our country. And I'm not even going to point which one is right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what happens. And why is that relevant? Why am I bringing this up? Like, how long do our memories last? When we think about Tiananmen Square, some of you weren't born. Some of you might have studied it in school. Some of you might have heard about it for the first time today. How long do our memories last when it comes to those things? How easy is it for our memories to shift and that we forget or we remember differently what really happened versus what we're taught? Or, pick it. How does that work with us? How does it work when we have a memory or we read something? Do we know that it's accurate? And today's passage and today's message focuses on this idea. And so turn with me to Hosea chapter 5. And we're jumping into the middle of a thought in Hosea in the Old Testament. Hosea chapter 5. And we'll do just a little bit of background on Hosea for a second to kind of get us aligned as to what's happening. And then we'll dive into the middle of Hosea chapter 5. So when we jump into Hosea, and we jump into Hosea chapter 5, we are specifically jumping into the middle of a thought. We're not starting at the beginning here. We're in the middle of a thought, and it's focused on the judgment of Israel. And it's focused on the judgment of Israel / Ephraim. And so just to clarify what we're talking about here when we talk about Ephraim, when we talk about this, if you remember your biblical history, we had one kingdom up until after Solomon dies. When Solomon dies, we have a split. We have a southern kingdom happen and a northern kingdom happen. Anybody remember how many tribes of Israel were in the northern kingdom? Right, we have 10 in the northern kingdom. Ephraim happens to be the largest and the most influential, and it also owns and lives in the area where places like Bethel and Shiloh were. And if you remember your biblical history, Bethel and Shiloh were like important places in biblical history. And so Ephraim encompasses that zone. Ephraim is the most influential. And so as we read this passage and we reference Ephraim, we're referencing the leaders, the most influential group in the northern kingdom, okay? We have the southern kingdom, there were 12 tribes, so 10 of them were in the northern kingdom. We got 2 in the southern kingdom. And the biggest and the most influential tribe of all, the tribe of Judah, is one of the tribes in the southern kingdom. And so when we reference in this passage, as we're talking, and we read Judah as being referenced or being talked to, it's kind of talked to in the singular, but it's referencing the kings, the leaders, the tribe of Judah that is the most influential of all the tribes, and especially in the southern kingdom. That is kind of the ruling group. They basically absorbed the tribe of Benjamin, and they become the predominant tribe. And so Hosea, who is preaching to the northern kingdom, is also preaching at the same time as people like Isaiah and Micah are preaching. So if you think about the Bible and your knowledge of history, Isaiah is alive at this time. Micah is alive at this time. Hosea is specifically focused on giving direction from God to the northern kingdom, while Isaiah and Micah are giving information and guidance from God to the southern kingdom. And so this is going on at the same time. You could read really interesting parallels as we would read, if you were to read Hosea and recognize that this is being directed to the northern kingdom, and then read Micah and recognize that it's being directed to the southern kingdom. And we're jumping into the middle of Hosea. Hosea is now kind of done with his life story and analogy of who he marries. I'm not even going to get into that today. That's a whole separate set of messages. But he is now giving direct, clear direction and instruction and words from God to the northern kingdom. And so we jump into verse 10 of of Hosea chapter 5, and we read, "The princes of Judah were like them that remove the bound. Therefore I will pour out my wrath upon them like water." So, remember what I just said. When he talks about the princes of Judah, he is referring to the most influential tribe. He's referring to the largest tribe. He's referring to the leaders of the largest tribe of all the tribes of Israel and Judah combined. And at this point, they're separate kingdoms, and so he's talking to the leadership of the southern kingdom. But we're not sure, is he talking about right now, or is he talking about when they were together? Like, is he referring to Solomon? Is he referring to Saul? Is he referring to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the leaders that caused the split, right? But what we do know is he's comparing the princes of Judah to those that removed bounds. That word and those phrases, the idea is those that remove the boundary, those that remove landmarks. The princes of Judah are like those that remove the boundaries, that remove your landmarks. And what is the reference point there? Think about what just happened in Hong Kong when the Chinese government removed the statues. Right? So we as society, we have landmarks. The Jewish people especially had landmarks. And let's think about what some of those landmarks might have been for the Jewish people. The Passover, a huge key landmark, right? The Passover, after the angel of death passed over, when the people were leaving Egypt, they were told that every year to commemorate what had happened. And so the Passover becomes like a huge key landmark. Think about every covenant that's established. The covenant that God makes with Adam, the covenant that God makes with Abraham, the covenant that God makes with Moses. Every one of those are landmarks for the people of Israel, for the Jewish people, and they're also boundaries for the people of Israel. And when you think of a boundary, think about your own property. Think about your own house. If you have a yard and if you don't have a fence, where does your property end? How do you know where your property ends? Well, the only way you know where your property ends if you don't have a fence is there's a surveyor that has gone out and has somewhere on your corner, more than likely, hammered in an iron stake. And it's probably underground, and it might be a little round disc, and it's probably buried, but somewhere there's an iron stake or a little round metal disc that's on your property that's buried that marks the corner of your property. And what would happen if in the middle of the night, somebody went out and decided to pull up all the stakes? And all of a sudden, you don't know where your property is anymore. And you and your neighbor are arguing over where the boundary is, and you can't find the boundary line anymore, right? Well, no, the tree's on my property. No, it's on my property, right? No, you have to have a boundary. And so the Jewish people had these boundaries. They had the Passover. They had all the other feasts that they were given. They had the covenants that were established. They even made physical boundaries. If you remember Ebenezer's, and I've preached about that in the past, that when they crossed the Red Sea, right, they established an Ebenezer. After they had the battles, if I remember correctly, after the battle, just before the Battle of Jericho, when they crossed the river, they set up another Ebenezer. They stacked stones so that they could have these memorials to remind them of what God had done for them. And Hosea says that the princes of Judah, the princes of the southern kingdom, are like those that go out in the middle of the night, or perhaps they go out in the middle of the day, and they don't want you to remember something, and so they remove the memorial. They remove the boundary. Our governments are doing it intentionally. You don't think that alleged added to a description of an event isn't intentional? Because just that one word starts to create a question 30 years later, did it really happen? Right? And so if I'm a leader am a prince of Judah in this time. And I'm being really called out for being like one that starts to remove boundaries. What does that start to mean? Does it mean that I'm trying I'm not following all the laws? I'm not following all the guidance that God has given me. I'm picking and choosing what seems to make sense, what's relevant in the moment. So on one end, we have these kings of Judah, these princes of Judah that are removing boundaries. Verse 11, Ephraim is oppressed and broken in judgment because he willingly walked after the commandment. And so Ephraim, remember who Ephraim represents now? Ephraim represents the northern kingdom because Ephraim is the largest tribe, the most influential tribe in the northern kingdom. When he's talking about Ephraim, he is saying that Ephraim represents the whole northern kingdom. And he condemns these people. And there's a point to all of this that gets really powerful when you start to add all of these up together. So just bear with me. He condemns the northern kingdom because he says you willingly walked after the commandment. Ephraim is oppressed. They're broken because they willingly walked after the commandment. What is he talking about when he says they willingly walked after the commandment? Well, we got to dig into the history a little bit. So when the two kingdoms split, Jerusalem ends up in the southern kingdom, right? It ends up in the area that's controlled by the southern kingdom, part of the tribe of Judah. And where is the temple? The temple's in Jerusalem at this point. And where are the people supposed to worship? The people are supposed to worship in Jerusalem at this point. They're supposed to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They're supposed to sacrifice at the temple. That's where they're supposed to go. But they're part of a different kingdom. See, the kings and the princes of the two kingdoms don't get along. And so what do I do if I'm in the northern kingdom, if I'm in the northern 10 tribes? What would you do? God says you're supposed to go to Jerusalem to sacrifice. So then how many of you would go to Jerusalem to sacrifice? Hopefully all of you. So let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 12, and we read what happens because King Jeroboam isn't too excited about that idea, because he wants to keep control, right? So 1 Kings chapter 12. Verse 26. And Jeroboam said in his heart, so remember, Jeroboam is the guy that kind of usurps authority, usurps his right from power. He takes over the 10 tribes. He's got the northern kingdom. Now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. What's the house of David? Judah, southern kingdom. Now the kingdom was going to return to the house of David if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam, king of Judah. I'm the king of the northern kingdom. I don't want you going to the southern kingdom. I don't want you going to Jerusalem, because if you go to Jerusalem, you might just realize that you should follow the guy I'm against, the other king, Rehoboam, and I'm going to lose my authority and my power. And they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam, king of Judah. In fact, you might rise up against me and kill me and decide you want a united kingdom again. And I don't want a united kingdom because I'm in charge here. And now we see what happens when you remove boundaries. Let's just keep reading here for a second. Whereupon the king took counsel, made two calves of gold specifically, and said unto them, the people, "It is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt." And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan, and this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. Does anybody else, when they read this, go, "What?" Or is it just me? What is it about golden calves that makes them really ideal for worship? Haven't we kind of read about this somewhere in the past? About a certain golden calf that was made that didn't end up going so hot? But for some reason, kings like golden calves. Some reason they think that golden calves are good to worship. And so King Jeroboam decides to make 2 golden calves. One isn't enough. Let's make 2 golden calves. Let's make it really convenient for my people not to go to Jerusalem. So not only am I going to make a golden calf, I'm going to make 2. I'm going to put one in Shiloh. I'm going to put one in Dan. You can pick and choose which one you want to go to. Look how convenient worship just got. Who needs Jerusalem? Don't you think that the first golden calf would have been a landmark? Do you think that the first golden calf would have been a boundary? It sure seems like it would be a boundary to me. It sure seems like it would have been a landmark moment that would have been passed on from generation to generation. Wouldn't you be like, if you experienced the golden calf, would you tell your kids about it? Like, this was a really bad day in the day of the Jewish people. Moses came down. He was not happy. People died. A lot of people died. We almost died, and God almost rejected us as a people that day. You'd think that that would be a day that lived in infamy too. But here we fast forward a long time. And that boundary that to us in retrospect seems so obvious isn't there. Right? The people, it says the people willingly accepted this command. The people of the northern kingdom didn't reject it. They didn't push back. They didn't fight. They didn't rebel and say, "No, we're going to Jerusalem because that's what God wants." The people willingly accepted the idea that they're going to worship a golden cow in one of 2 locations. And God says, Ephraim is oppressed, and they're broken because of it. They were unfaithful. These people were unfaithful. They were going to, what we can tell is that they weren't forced, they weren't coerced, they chose to ignore that direct link that they had to the past. They chose to follow a law of man that contradicted a law of God. Right? Literally contradicted what God had told them to do. And they chose to just do it. And it reveals their heart. Doesn't it? It reveals your heart. They were going through the motions. They might have been saying that they believed, but they didn't. And so that's the situation that we're in. And so the question kind of here for us, just if we take a moment, is what do our actions reveal? Are we in positions where we clearly don't believe? Are we in positions where we're saying one thing, but our heart is far from God? Do we say one thing, but our actions reveal a totally different heart? It's a question that I have for myself. For some of us, we could just be saying, "Hey, this is great for you. Just do your thing. I'm doing my thing." Okay. For others of us, we might be saying, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I'm a follower in Jesus Christ. And how many of you are saying that? I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. And for how many of us do our actions show that our words are a lie? How many of us are unfaithful? We say one thing, but we're really doing something else. You know, what are our landmarks? For some of us, it might be our baptism. For some of us, it might be the peace that we have with God. For some of us, it might be what we've been taught. But here's what happened to those people, and here's the reality for each one of us, friends, brothers, sisters, and that's that the further we go from the truth, the longer that we're away from the truth, the more likely it is for those boundaries, for those landmarks to become blurred, to fade away. The more likely it is for us to intentionally squash them. You know, I was not that long ago, I was driving down this road where I remembered, I even shared it with my family. This is the road where my first office was on. This is where the first architect that I worked for was on this road. And I drove by the road, and I remember, so not by the road, I'm on the road, and I remember where the office was. And I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you. Some of you might be too young for it to have happened to you, but it's really disconcerting when that office is no longer there. Right? The building isn't there. And so now you're driving along a road, and I'm like, I think it's here. But everything looks so different that I have to ask myself, am I really on the right road? Am I actually just on the wrong road? Is this the road that the office was on? Because everything is so different. The office is gone. That landmark is gone. And that's the way it is in our lives, though, right? That's what happens in our lives, is that the truth of the gospel is a landmark. The truth of the gospel is like my office. And when it's there, I know where I am relative to it. But the further I am away, the longer time goes on. What happens if what I've been taught is no longer there? Where am I? Am I on the right road? Am I where I need to be? Things get blurry. Things get messed up. And so as we read on here in verse 12, we read, "Therefore will I be unto Ephraim as a moth, and to the house of Judah as rottenness." Really interesting what he says. He says the reality of what's going to happen is I'm going to remove myself. He says that later in verse 15. He says, I'm going to remove myself. And what's going to happen is that this removal is going to lead to a gradual deterioration. Have you ever had a wool sweater that's been put away in a closet for the summer, and you pull out that wool sweater in the fall, and you put it on, and somebody says, you got a hole in your sweater. And you're like, what? And then you look, and maybe you got more than one hole. Maybe you've got 4 or 5 holes because you got a moth in your closet. And moths like wool. And they like to chip away and eat away at that wool. And before you know it, you take off that sweater and you look, and man, there's a hole in the armpit that's unraveling. There's a hole on the bottom. Maybe there's a hole in the back that you didn't see. And if you let that moth go too far, what happens to your sweater? It's toast, right? It's toast. And so Hosea says that God is saying that his removal is going to be like a moth attacking your sweater. That's what he says to Ephraim. And to Judah, it's like rot that sets in. And I remember going to my father-in-law's house back in New Jersey, And he asked me to take care of, back in the day, I don't even know if he remembers this. Back in the day, he had a little bit of rot under a window up on the second floor, up over the garage. Right? Everything in the house is painted white, and you just saw this little bit of gray that was starting to peek through. So I go up on the roof, and have you ever done this with your house or with anything, right? If you're in construction, decks, this is famous stuff on decks, right? You go to your deck, but in this case, I was up on the roof. I'm just supposed to replace this little piece of wood because it's rotten, and I have a chisel and a screwdriver and stuff to pry this away. And you ever start to poke at that wood? And it's painted really good. And you kind of push, and it's soft. And you push, and it's soft. And you push, and it's soft. And if you want to, you just push in, and it just goes right through that paint. And there's nothing underneath that paint, because that paint is hiding the fact that the wood underneath has been completely rotted out and eaten away. And with my father-in-law's house, under that window, that board that needed to be replaced was a lot bigger than what we thought it was going to be. And so Hosea says that God removing himself from you to the kingdom of Judah is going to be like rot. It can look good on the outside. It's going to be disintegrated on the inside. But what's the answer? What's powerful about this passage is that God removes himself, but he says something else. And we're just going to jump to chapter 6. And Hosea says this in chapter 6. Come, and let us return unto the Lord, for he is torn, and he will heal. He is smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us. And the third day he will raise us up, and we will live in his sight. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning. He shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and former rain unto the earth. You know what was so profound to me is that there's a promise here. And as we think about a new year, and we think about our lives and where we're at, are we saying one thing and doing another? Have we deliberately burned, buried, knocked down the boundaries, the landmarks that God has given us? Have they become blurred and knocked down because we haven't taken care of them and we haven't reminded ourselves of them and we haven't been focused on God's law and on what God wants us to do? The law of Jesus. And we haven't been focused on that. That even in spite of all of that, there's hope if we turn to the Lord. And so he says to the Jewish people, I've removed myself. I've removed myself, and this rot, this eating away that the moth does is going to become apparent. But there is hope. And in this new year, there is hope for each one of us to turn back to Jesus or to turn to Jesus for the first time. To be honest and real, not faking it, not pretending, not going through the motions, not saying I believe, but my actions showing something totally else, but to literally turn to God. That's what he says to the Jewish people here. And it was so striking to me that he says that I have torn, but I can heal. That Jesus is coming, he tells them. Jesus is coming. There's hope in Jesus. I mean, after 2 days, he will revive us. In the third day, he will raise us up, and we will live in his sight. Talk about prophecy, about Jesus coming. that because of Jesus, we can all be revived. Because of Jesus, we can live. And that corrupted, rotted wood, the moth-eaten sweater, doesn't have to be patched. You don't have to pretend that it looks good and patch it and paint it and pretend it's okay. It can be removed and replaced with a new heart, with a new you because of Jesus. You know, Christ was born. Christ died. He was resurrected so that the unfaithful could become the faithful, so that we could all live. I guess kind of just as a closing thought is, let's not be Judah and remove the boundaries. Let's not be Ephraim and willingly walk away from the command of God. Let's be the faithful.